speaker by order of presentation will be Honek Ochella, who has 25 years experience, if I'm not mistaken, of head of office UNHCR in Tanzania, who will explain to us very briefly the history of vulnerability categories and their usefulness in humanitarian programs. The second speaker will be Sophie Nakuera. Sophie, who is a member, not only member, but in charge of the Africa project empirical data collection for VULNER. She has been collecting data in Uganda, and she also has been collecting data in South Africa. And this afternoon, we will focus on Uganda, where she has done interview work, has collected impressive data, and she will be, so to say, the very first presentation of empirical data within the VULNER program. Another speaker this afternoon is Julie Berg, Director of the Scottish Centre of Crime and Justice Centre in Glasgow. She has been also previously at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and she will explain to us how she understands what she calls polycentric governance system and how that relates to the topic of vulnerability. So feel very welcome, Julie, and then you will speak after Sophie. Our last speaker, and there is this nice expression in English, last but not least, is Larissa Vetters. And with Larissa, we just come to Europe, really, where she's working on asylum-seeking procedures in Germany, and will focus maybe less, she said, and she wanted us to underscore on this vulnerability, but more on the fragmentation of the working with vulnerable asylum seekers in Germany. And then the floor will be yours, which is, we will give you the floor through Q&A. We suggested, in order not to be unfair, not to overlook, or maybe feel people under the pressure of time and or hesitant, or they feel they couldn't raise their hands in due time, that we will proceed through the chat system. So make sure that you have your questions on the chat. And if, for lack of time, we do not really manage to address all the questions, Sophie Nakuera is really kind of prepared to address them after the webinar. So make sure, if you really want your question to be addressed, you feel you didn't have the input today, this is not your last chance. And then, to the very end of the meeting, we will listen to you, Catherine Lebrun, your Deputy Director for Research at the Center for Lebanese Studies, and you will be really in charge of the closing remarks. I would say our destiny, in a way, is in your hands. Yeah. With this, I hope that I have kind of given you the key of the distribution for the 1.5 hour upcoming, and I wish us all to learn a lot from all the exchanges we will have. But again, your insights are also important. Don't forget, there is a Q&A for having your own input. I now leave the floor to you, Luc, and thank you for being with us this afternoon, and we'll listen to you.
Thank you very much, Marie-Claire, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Sophie, for organizing this event together with Population Europe. I'll be very short so that we can move on to the presentation. Just to say a few very quick words on the VULNER project, which is a collaborative research project that I have the pleasure to coordinate, and which involves research partners across Europe, Canada, and in the Middle East to study this concept of vulnerability. And maybe just as a way of introduction, let me say you a few words on why we thought it would be interesting to have this cross-cutting analysis of this notion of vulnerability by studying it in Europe, in Canada, but also in the Middle East and in Uganda. And today, the results that will be presented refer, of course, to the research that Sophie Nakuera conducted in Uganda. And the reason why we wanted to involve these different contexts is very simply that we noticed that the focus on vulnerability might be relatively new when it comes to the legal and policy discourse on asylum and migration in Europe and Canada, where vulnerability assessments are increasingly being performed in order to identify who will benefit from protection and who will be benefiting from access to certain services such as housing, healthcare, etc. While this is quite new in Europe and Canada, it has been done for quite a long time in the Middle East and in Uganda where vulnerability has been for a very long time a criteria to identify the people who will benefit from access to protection services, including to resettlement program. And that's why we wanted to include this different context in our research and in the VULNER project through a common methodological approach that's how to combine the analysis of vulnerability in law and in the practices of the public servants who implement the law. How do they define vulnerability? How do they rely on it? What kind of concrete meanings do they put behind it in using it in their daily practices? With the experiences of migrants, how do they relate to these understandings of vulnerability? Do they think that it fits within their own experiences? And how does this, in the end, also shape their experiences? And what we'll listen to today are different presentations around the research that Sofina Kouera conducted in Uganda, which is an ethnographic research. So she spent a lot of time in the refugee camp of Nachivale to meet with people from aid organizations and agencies, as well as with refugees over there to investigate these questions. And without further ado, I'm very happy to give the floor to the speaker, and I wish you a very pleasant and enjoyable discussion.
Well, our first speaker is Enoch Ochala from the UNHCR, Head of Office, Tanzania. I just would say, I hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Madam Director. Very good afternoon to all of you. My name is Enoch Ochala. Thank you for pronouncing my name very well, because not many people do that. As you mentioned, rightly mentioned, I'm currently heading an office in Tanzania called Kibondo. But prior to that, I was also heading the office in Nakivale. Without going further to my 25 years of experience, but I would focus more on the Nakivale situation, since this is the subject that we're discussing this afternoon. When Dr. Sophie was doing the research, I was heading the office in Nakivale, and I was also covering Uruchinga settlement, which is an annex to Nakivale. I just want to give you some few concerns here on my side in terms of internet connectivity. I'm in a deep field location where we have heavy rains and storms in the afternoons, and there is one that is already looming. So I wouldn't want to risk going off. Instead, I will shut down the video after the introduction. And the other thing is, I have just flew a few days ago, and you can hear my voice is a bit rough. So please bear with me. I will try to make myself as audible as I could. Otherwise, I will be happy to be with you today. And secondly, I really want to thank Dr. Sophie for contacting me, because this is an important subject for UNHCR. We do our programming keeping in the center the vulnerability categories. Therefore, it's important for me to be with you in this very important forum with very high-profile people on the call that I'm observing. And I'm glad you invited me, and I'm so happy to be here. And many thanks for the invitation. And I will try my best to be as brief as I could. This topic is an important topic to UNHCR, and often when we are discussing in webinars like this, it takes a little bit of time, but I will try to make it as short, as precise as I could. So if you allow me to do so, I will switch off my video so that I don't risk to be cut off should the rain start very soon. So you will continue to listen to me. But then, God willing, if I do not go off, and then I will put it on later once I finish with my discussion with you. So my video is off for now, and I will start talking to you. Okay, let's start. I just want to give you a bit of overview of where did we come from in terms of the vulnerability of refugees. As you all know, when UNHCR was born over 70 years ago, indeed, the vulnerability categories exist within the population that we deal with. Is a diverse population. 72, 73 years later, the same diverse population remains in our camps dealing with. But then prior to that, our planning has always not been really focusing on the vulnerability and the needs of the people that we are here to assist. Our planning has always been resource-based, has always been needs-based, which doesn't really address the needs of the people who are vulnerable. Therefore, there was a need for change, which the High Commissioner introduced way back in 2004. So in 2004, UNHCR came together as a team, and we decided to come up with what we call the age and gender diversity mainstreaming. This is an approach that takes into consideration the different age categories, the different gender, the different diversity within the population that we deal with, and how we could involve them and how we could make them participate. So during the next 15 minutes, I will try to cover a little bit of background where we're coming from, the objectives for change, the mainstreaming in programming. Of course, we have vulnerability types and categories, and the vulnerability-centered programming, which is the key element that I would want to discuss with you. So in 2004, we came up with an overall goal of ensuring gender equality and the employment of rights by all persons of concern, while at the same time also leveraging the rich range of capacities that exist within communities to bring about positive change. This is all about making the way we do business change over time, looking at the people we deal with. We look at conducting regular participatory assessments with persons that we're here to serve. In the past, during my early days in UNHCR, our planning has never involved the people we serve. Rather, we sit in our offices on our desk, we plan and we tell them this is what we can do for you with money we're receiving from donors. And that has not always been helping the situation because we are not addressing the root causes, the risk, the concerns, the priorities, and of course, not looking also at the capacities of the community we deal with. Therefore, there was a need for change, and we thought maybe by involving refugees in the planning process, by conducting focus group discussions to begin with as a baseline situation, would have helped us to identify the key issues that are affecting their life. We also look at undertaking analysis to identify targeted actions, because with the dwindling resources that we're receiving from donors, our efforts should focus more on targeting actions that are directly benefiting the community without any discrimination, without also leaving some people behind, because as UN, we don't believe of leaving others behind. We look at mainstreaming age and gender diversity analysis into all our activities, from planning to implementation to evaluation, and at the same time also to feedback mechanisms, which we never had in the past. We do not go back to our people we serve to give them feedback as to what information we collected, what did we do with it. And of course, the accountability element also is an element that is key. We cannot deal with people without being accountable. We are accountable to donors, but we should be also accountable to the people we serve. So before I go further, let me just talk about why participation, because participation is a global, it's an overall right, it's a basic human right that should be available for each and every human being, regardless of their status, being vulnerable or being a person within different categories. And it is also one of those commitments that the High Commission names in its priorities for women and children. Therefore, participation is always at the center of our planning to make sure refugees are involved when we are planning. The participation should not just be limited at collecting data at the grassroots, but should also be involving at all stages of the camp life. As you know, you may not know, camp has a lifespan. The camp lifespan starts from design and setup, care and maintenance, when you have people to care for inside the camp. And of course, there is a phase out and a closure. So within these three phases of camp life cycle, you need to involve refugees at all phases of the camp life when you're doing your work. Of course, it applies also to project management cycle, because while we often involve refugees at the assessment level, we do not involve them at the analysis, because we do analysis on our desk in the offices. We do not involve them when we're implementing and coordinating. We do not involve them when we're doing monitoring, and we do not involve them when we're doing evaluation. So we felt refugees need to be involved at all cycles of program management. We look at what has changed by doing this. In the past, way back before we launched this new strategy in 2005, there was no proper consultation with the people we serve. There was a limited consultation with only maybe male leaders, But now it has changed towards participation of all women, girls, boys, and including people living with disability. In the past, we used to have ad hoc discussions. Maybe as a head of office, I'm riding in a very big Land Cruiser. I meet a refugee chairperson in the camp. I will stop and ask him or her, do you have a minute? Can I inform you that UNHCR is planning to do ABCD? And that is how it used to be. It's just an ad hoc discussion. There was no organized, systematic, interactive, or information gathering. So now we have that. Often we used to listen to voices of refugee male leaders, but now it has changed. It has voices of refugee women, girls, boys, and men at all levels of different age categories, gender, and diversity. And we used to program without participation. As I mentioned earlier, we plan on our desk in offices. We only tell the refugees what we're going to do for them. But now the refugees are at the center of it. We take into consideration the age, gender, diversity, and community and right-based programming. That is basically why participation matters. Now let me look into the age and gender diversity mainstreaming, which is the key policy paper that we came out with. Our mission is to safeguard rights and well-being of all persons of concern, regardless of their gender, diversity, regardless of their age, gender group. So our mission is to make sure rights and well-beings of all persons are preserved. We look at equal access to UNHCR protection services and resources. We also look at, we're committed to addressing discrimination and inequality, not only to ensure equitable outcomes for all persons of concern. These are some of the objectives that we came up with. Of course, we're looking to achieve the age and gender diversity mainstreaming approach and targeted actions to address protection gaps, because there are so many protection gaps in our communities in the camps, and our mission is to make sure those gaps are addressed. And of course, we're looking about meaningful participation of women, in particular girls, men and boys, because in the past it used to be only men, but now we're looking at meaningful participation. So we launched this new strategy in 2005. And 5 years later, we did an evaluation in 2009 to make sure we are on the right track. And then we came up with really very interesting findings during this evaluation after 5 years of an implementation of the first interesting finding is the age and gender mainstreaming approach introduced the interrelated and mutually reinforcing notions of rights-based, community-based, and participatory approach, which never existed before. The second interesting finding is the shift from pre-identified group of vulnerables or extremely vulnerable persons, because you cannot pre-identify vulnerable and extremely vulnerable persons, typically used for categorization in UNHCR. That's how we used to do business. But this pilot project showed us that predetermined vulnerability doesn't actually work in terms of needs of the population. We look at the less prescriptive concept to encourage the staff and partners also to simply label individuals as vulnerable, because yes, every refugee would love to be called vulnerable because it has some strings attached to it. But this policy, this strategy, help us to leave that notion of just labeling refugees as vulnerable. We look at it also as evolving understanding of material, social, economic, political, legal dimensions of protecting specific groups of refugees, because not every refugee has the same needs. Needs are determined by the vulnerability, of course, by the also context and also the profile of the refugees that you're dealing with. But the last but not the least, we also looked at the strategy established a direct link with the development of UNHCR operational budgets. In the past, our budgets were based on the population figures, but not necessarily on the actual needs and on the actual population data that is aggregated. So this strategy helped us to do that. So the evaluation actually gave us a very interesting outcomes at operational level. It shows that UNHCR progress in the area of the age and gender diversity has yielded impact in areas, which is participatory approaches within the planning process is a key, and this is what we embraced. Involving all sectors in the planning process, not necessarily only protection, but other sectors included, was also helpful. So we came up with what we call the multifunctional team approach, which helps to make sure we address the needs without leaving others behind. We look at also coming up with policies, because one of the issues that we were grappling with is the lack of policies, clear policies on vulnerability, on the age and gender mainstreaming prior to 2005 launched strategy. We look at the participatory assessment, increased interaction with persons of concern. The only challenge there is the feedback mechanism, because if you keep going to the people, you collect data and you don't go back, then it doesn't really help the situation. Therefore, the feedback mechanism is also one of the findings that helped us to make sure we keep going back and give feedback. Of course, the strategy also helped us to introduce the 206, which was launched in 2007, the groundbreaking UN accountability framework for aid workers, which help us. So among the challenges, which are many, but I will just want to pick few because of time, there is actually gaps in terms of personnel. In UNHCR, we're not trained to deal with certain areas of expertise. Each and every one of us have our own expertise that we deploy within the organization, but it shows clearly that we actually lack expertise, and thus call for more training and more engagement. We look at the policy, which I already mentioned. We didn't have a policy prior to this strategy, so there was a need for us to come up with a policy, which we all now have, that came to power in 2011 and revised in 2018. We also look at who do we engage with, because within the people that we work with in terms of partnership, do we only continue dealing with the traditional partners? Do we also expand our scope of partnership to non-traditional partners? And I think when you look at Max Planck as an institute that is very well known, such academic institutes, I think, could really suit into our partnership interest that we are building around changes that we're trying to deploy as UNHCR. Now, the way forward is we need to strengthen accountability for AGDM. Accountability should be one of the priorities. We need to build staff capacity. We need to really strengthen our monitoring and evaluation. We need to prioritize our resource allocation, not just based on the needs, but also based on the actual finding. We now have a policy. Of course, we should be guided by this policy, which is being revised every now and then. The first revision was in 2018, and now we are implementing the changes that were made. And we also need to commit ourselves. The High Commissioner called upon the senior management to have more commitment, to have more energy within the leadership and within the management of UNHCR. And I think that is what we intend to do as managers and as leaders. And of course, as I mentioned already, we need to also expand our partnership with non-traditional and traditional UNHCR partners. So for the interest of time, I just want to conclude by saying vulnerability has always been there from the onset when UNHCR was born 72 years ago. The coding are there. We have almost more than 100 vulnerability codes in our database, which is very recorded. But then what do we do with this data? So what we have started now, coming up with these strategies and policies, is helping us to make sure we had an up-to-date and credible data to our donors that we could be proud of sharing. We have a data that inform actually the people we serve. Therefore, it gives us the opportunity to be able to make sure we get it right. To conclude, I just want to speak as a living veteran within UNHCR, if you allow me to do so, to just say a few final last words. Particularly, I'm interested on the contested vulnerability vis-a-vis refugees' experience of humanitarian program, which is the subject of this workshop this afternoon. You know, having been worked in refugee camps for the last more than 2 decades, when the people we serve, I refer to them, this is the new High Commissioner terminology referring to refugees as the people we serve. When they see visitors, strangers in the camp, everything changes. Everything we do become negative. Everything we do become really not helping the situation. This is very well understood because of the circumstances, the scenarios that they find themselves in, and of course, the duration of the life that they spend in a camp. So there is a dispute, of course. I'm not really doubting that. But for us, we're used to it because of what we know about the refugees. For your information, the average lifespan of a camp is 17 years. In some cases, for example, if you go to places like Kenya, you have Dadaab, you have Kakuma, they've been there for over 30 years and have served in both camps. If you go to some of the settlements, including Nakivale or Ruchinga in Uganda, they have been in existence since the late 50s and the early 60s. So you have generation after generation living in a camp situation. So whenever they see an opportunity coming forward, leave alone a researcher or who is asking questions like Sophie, they think there is a resettlement coming. Therefore, the whole vulnerability situation and the responses we are making become obsolete and become also nothing. Therefore, the dispute arises. As a veteran also who has seen it, what it was 2 decades ago, I can speak with an authority, actually, how we are mastering various changes in the way we do business as we continue to grow as an organization over 70 years now. Just to mention a few significant changes, I'm sure all of you know about the 2016 Global Compact on Refugees, the GRF, that created the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, which was endorsed by the whole 193 UN member states. And of course, eventually we also went to the Global Refugee Forum in December 2019, where the member states came up with hundreds and hundreds of pledges. I don't have the figures of aid, but I would have loved to share with you. But that really bring a paradigm shift from the way and the traditional way how UNHCR does business, and how also the change was really coming, and for us, how we are now embracing the change, and how the change is being embraced by the refugees, and how the change is also being embraced by the people we work with, the traditional and the non-traditional partners, the donors, and the government counterparts that we work with in all the countries around the globe that we serve the people we are here to serve. So with that, I want to say once again, thank you. I want to stop there. As I mentioned to Sophie, I may not stay with you through or out, but I would love to do so, but I will remain around for some time until my next meeting comes on, and I will have to leave you. And Madam, back to you, and I hope I did not surpass my 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. And I like the way that you present yourself as a living veteran, because that enables you just to do this kind of retrospection and also take already a bit a looking forward approach. Thank you so much. If there would be questions addressed to you specifically, and you have to leave us, then Sophie will be sure that we convey the questions to you. But stay with us as long as you can. And I think this was a perfect introduction for you then, Sophie, to take over now and to speak from the field and probably following up on some of the observations. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
The floor is yours, Sophie.
Thank you. Can you allow me to share my screen, please?
Sorry, I will make you co-host and then it should be possible.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you so much. We heard from Enoch Ochala from UNHCR, who gave you a history of the vulnerabilities and what they're meant to do. And then I'll give you the refugees' experiences. I went to Nakivale refugee settlement, and I conducted interviews with refugees, not only in their homes. I also made observations of the implementation practices, and access was negotiated to these spaces by refugee workers and refugees. So the data is triangulated by both aid workers and the refugees themselves. The people I interviewed fell within the bureaucratic categories of UNHCR, which are elderly persons, persons with disabilities, LGBTQIA+ survivors, but also those who fall outside those categories, because I wanted to understand how those people experience vulnerability and what factors exacerbate their suffering. So for this particular context, I want to show you what categories do in these settlements. Uganda is one of the largest refugee hosting countries in Africa. It's actually the largest hosting country. According to the UNHCR statistics that were uploaded on 5th of April, so these are very recent statistics, Uganda has over 1.5 million refugees. It has an open door policy, very progressive laws, and Uganda's refugee model is hailed as the model to emulate around the world. And that is because of its open door policy. The challenge is that it is surrounded by many countries in conflict. And so when you look at the map, where the cursor is, that's where most of the refugees are from, South Sudan. But I conducted my research here at the border of Tanzania and Uganda, and it's close to Rwanda. So this particular settlement often gets mass influxes from refugees from DR Congo and Burundi, but it also hosts people from Somalia, Rwanda, and other areas. The refugee management is managed by OPM, which is the State Agency for Refugees, and UNHCR. Uganda's humanitarian approach, as you heard from Enoch, focuses on the AGD policy, which means leave no one behind. They address the needs of the most vulnerable people in order to have an inclusive protection approach. The categories are actually very universal. They don't focus on Uganda alone, but are used in every operation where UNHCR has. So we have standard categories that are used in different contexts. Particularly in Uganda, Uganda partners with different state agencies and uses a multi-sectoral approach, as Enoch explained, to address refugees' needs from health, food, security, and education. So from a design point of view, it is a very good approach because it takes a whole of society approach and it's very holistic. It tries to assess refugees' needs from the grassroots, and at every single point, there are focal points where people will be assessed for their vulnerabilities, and they will either be addressed or they will be referred to the agency that is most equipped to address those vulnerabilities. So people are grouped into women at risk, unaccompanied minors, separated children, many different categories in order to have a more targeted response. On top of that, there are also more narrower categories, as in EVIs, extremely vulnerable person, people with specific needs. I mean, the categories go on. As he explained, there are over 100 different categories. I can't list them here. For resettlement, you have very broad and specific categories. I'm only mentioning a few here. Many of them include, if you have severe medical needs that cannot be addressed in the country, you are eligible for resettlement, women at risk, children, elderly refugees, and people who lack local integration prospects. So you can see that these are very broad categories, and many people could easily fit within these categories. Because people who are fleeing, for example, conflict have been experienced violence and torture. So that's a very broad category. The challenge is Uganda has a very high number of refugees. The resources are very constrained. People are the agencies are very severely underfunded. In fact, when I did my fieldwork, most of the aid workers didn't know if they were going to keep their jobs. So it's not just refugees that are facing the effects of the funding constraints, but it's also the aid workers themselves who don't have that job security. So they are very severely understaffed. So you have, in this particular camp, 171,000 refugees, but 2 doctors in the health center. So you can imagine the waiting queues. So any criticism in this presentation is not necessarily of the aid workers, but to show you the challenges under which they have to work. So because many people fit within the vulnerability categories, there is a competition. It's an unintended vulnerability competition, where people try to fit in as many categories as they can in order to get humanitarian assistance or to qualify for resettlement. So the effects of these categories, because they focus on the most vulnerable, they legitimize certain forms of suffering and they legitimize others. This confirms what Didier Fassin explains as compassion in humanitarian reason is not unconditional. Yes, you're vulnerable, but we will give you assistance on condition of this. So it's not just enough to be vulnerable. You must be really, really vulnerable. So this renders some refugees deserving of humanitarian assistance and others undeserving. Just to give you an example, when I did interviews with male survivors of gender-based violence, their complaint was they do not get enough assistance. In fact, until very recently, most of the humanitarian agencies didn't even focus on them. The focus was on female survivors of gender-based violence. And the argument of male survivors of gender-based violence is that the humanitarian operation promotes or fosters LGBTQIA because their needs are listened to and they are fast-tracked for resettlement. So the way they reason is, if someone chooses to sleep with another man, why are you rewarding him? We were victims of rape. Why are you not taking us for resettlement? Because within the eyes of the community, they have a very masculine or traditional way of looking at men. Men cannot be raped. So if you were raped, surely you really wanted to have sex with another man, So you have all this going on, that confusion. So the effect of the categories, because largely they focus on women and children, they have a very gendering tendency. And Miriam Ticktin has argued that in such cases, in humanitarianism, the perfect victim is usually the vulnerable woman or child. So when I talked to the refugees themselves and tried to understand what their lived experiences were, many of them gave different experiences than what the humanitarian organizations targeted. For example, some of them complained that they are fleeing countries and that are very near Uganda, and yet they are in settlements close to those countries. So many of them who had fled, for example, political persecution, were afraid that they could easily be kidnapped or assassinated. And Uganda has had instances where people have been actually kidnapped and refollowed back to Rwanda, for example. Some of them also explained that the services are not very well distributed in the 79 villages. And so accessing those services was difficult, particularly in the case of people with disabilities. The system, although it means well, it addresses vulnerability from a different angle, from very different angles. It is very siloed. It has a very siloed approach. So people have intersectional problems that are not well coordinated in terms of the assistance they get. So you find that the delays exacerbate existing vulnerabilities. But the two main things that came out of the experiences were mainly complaints about livelihood and health. Uganda has a self-reliant strategy that focuses on agriculture, but refugees are coming from countries where agriculture is not the main way of earning a living. And they're also getting more elite refugees who don't know how to farm. So that homogeneous response to or approach to overcoming dependence is not working very well for those who are not used to farming. Because the system rewards victimhood, which is an unintended consequence, there's something to be benefited if you are vulnerable. It has brought up illicit documentary practices. People have complained that when they go to the police to report, maybe they've been raped or they've experienced certain forms of violence, the police charges them for the police report because they ask, what is in it for me? I will give you this report and you can use it as currency for resettlement. So why would I give you this report for no money? The problem is that also this causes distrust. Humanitarian actors themselves know that a police report can be bought. So when refugees go with a police report to show that they've experienced some form of vulnerability, the aid workers don't trust the authenticity of that report because people largely perceive the police to be corrupt. So in sum, the refugee response from the perspective of refugees is very corrupt because they perceive it to be corrupt, not necessarily because that is the fact. They perceive it to be corrupt because they don't understand the selection criteria. And this is because donors who give money have their own interest in what they want to fund. So in one incidence, they may have funded, let's say, Burundian women who are victims of sexual violence. But then when you go back after a few years or months, their focus will have changed. They will be maybe funding male survivors. So someone who was raped in the year when that agency is no longer addressing that issue will not understand why that changed, because there's a lack of transparency in how people are selected and how these criteria work. So this causes not only confusion, but fuels allegations of corruption. There's a problem in the design of the aid programs. They mean well, but because they are meant to target short-term assistance, they have the short-term assistance, but long-term development approach. They only address vulnerabilities for a particular time. So if that time ends and the protection need hasn't ended, people don't understand why the help or assistance stopped. And the biometric verification system, which helps verify that people are actually getting what they need to get, has unintended effects that is promoting encampment. Because every few months, people have to be verified and collect the digital cash or food. That interrupts employment, and some of them don't get paid enough. So if they are living far away, most of their money is spent on coming to collect €3 a month. If you're not very vulnerable, that's what you're getting in Uganda. If you're very vulnerable, you're getting €5. And the reason why the money is that limited is because it's supposed to supplement your livelihood. But I talked to people who said that they lost their jobs because they didn't want to miss verification and be taken out of the database as refugees. But the system was indeed brought in to curb ghost refugees or mitigate fraud. So how do refugees respond? Refugees are not mere victims. They actually try to negotiate these categories. They have come up with their own organizations. There's a proliferation of refugee-led organizations that are organized around their own lived vulnerability. Of course, they're not very well funded. Some of them don't have funding at all, but they use these agencies or associations to try and lobby for better interventions or to have their interventions included. They also mobilize bureaucratic terminology. Even though their vulnerabilities do not fit, for example, people with albinism, they try to show why they should be eligible for resettlement because they are from countries like Tanzania or Congo or Burundi where their body parts have currency. People use them for witchcraft rituals. So one of the people I talked to had his daughter got lost within a month of getting into the camp. But when she went to report to the police accused him of hiding the child in order to get resettlement. But his concern was, my child is albino and she got lost. And up to now, they never found her, And he blames the police for not having reacted. But it shows you the system of mutual distrust because of what you can get when you're vulnerable.
Sophie, I really hate what I'm going to do, but I really invite you to watch and maybe come to your kind of conclusion or final statement so that we can also listen.
The next one is the conclusion, so I'll just be quick. Yeah. So what this has done is that some of them resist programs that might make them resilient, because if you're resilient, then you don't have a chance at resettlement. So some of them just refuse to, let's say, borrow money for microfinance organizations that could help them start small businesses. It has also led to South-South movements, some of them to go to other countries when they see that there's no hope. Currently, there are more people now going to Kenya. Others are taking on the voluntary repatriation program in Burundi, but when they go there, they find that they can't stay there, so they are also going to Kenya. So you find that there's a circulation of vulnerable bodies within the region. Others who have means are taking routes to Europe through other areas that people don't know about. So to conclude, the structural weaknesses in the protection system is undermining the protection. There are limitations to laws. While Uganda has very good laws and policies, the fact that it doesn't have the finances and resources is not helpful. So the ambiguous selection criteria fuels distrust and fuels allegations of corruption, which may not even be founded, where the aid worker has to actually adhere to the donor interests. It is also bringing up contradictory effects of humanitarian policies, such as its defeating self-reliance when people fear to leave the camp because they will miss verification. And thus, the system wholly sustains and reproduces vulnerability for some. Thank you.
Well, I feel so sorry, Sophie, because time does injustice to the richness of your data. But for the people who would be really interested in listening a little bit and reading a little bit more, there is the policy brief that you have been issuing in February this year, and where you also have a kind of number of key messages. And I think some of these key messages came back in your conclusions. So there is a possibility to fall back on. And there will be, of course, also your research report on Uganda that very much details what you said here in a nutshell. Thank you so much. I think we see the complementarity between the first and the second presentation easily. And now we will have another kind of presentation, which is, if I'm not mistaken, a little bit more conceptual. And I give you now the floor, Julie. Maybe also with the message, please watch the watch.
Great, thank you. I will be watching the watch. I just need to share my screen, so I would need to be made a co-host as well.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. So I hope that my presentation will be complementary to Sophie, and I think it is, because obviously I followed her work and I've done a lot of work on polycentric governance systems, because what she's describing is a polycentric system of governance in operation. That's what it is, and that's how I've interpreted it. And so what this presentation is going to do, it's going to outline, well, what is polycentric governance? How is it being applied and challenged within the humanitarian context? And given these challenges, what really is the way forward in terms of achieving, if possible, effective and equitable polycentric governance? And that really is going to end with a challenge to everybody in terms of the implications of having this type of polycentric governance system. So firstly, what is polycentric governance? And I've got an image on the right there that kind of showcases that it's a plural system of governance, but essentially taking this quote from the originators of the concept, it is, as this diagram shows, it's many centers of decision making, and they may connect with each other, and they are usually formally independent, but they take account of each other. And they may be in processes of cooperation or competition, or they may work past each other. But essentially, it's a plural system of a number of nodes, or a number of actors. And some of the features really are that they may engage in processes of negotiation and bargaining. They might have different capacities or forms of power or resources or knowledge. And again, think about what I'm saying in light of what Sophie just said. So, I mean, this is conceptual and abstract, but if you think about what Sophie's saying, you can see how this is reflected in kind of the humanitarian process. They may operate also at different scales. They may operate at global and local scales, and their jurisdictions may also overlap. The system in its entirety may be a self-organizing system or self-governing system. So in other words, it's not necessarily a command and control or a hierarchical top-down system, or there may be components of hierarchy within that. So in other words, if you look at it in this way, all governance systems are to a greater or lesser extent polycentric. Governments are polycentric. It's impossible to have a system which isn't polycentric, because you're always going to be engaging, whether within a system or outside of a system, in a polycentric way. I mean, can you think of any system that isn't, to some extent, a polycentric or a plural one? So what are the benefits? I mean, there are many benefits of it. If you're a recipient within a polycentric system, the theory and practice, and I've shown in my own empirical work, is the fact that citizens can sometimes select services appropriate to their needs because they have a choice. They have a choice in actors that they can draw on. The problem is, of course, that in sites of weak or limited or hostile stated, even whatever context, these services can be both legitimate and illegitimate. And I'll speak to that a bit later, maybe. Plurality, polycentric governance systems encourage innovation in service provision because there is usually a degree of competition in terms of providers. So if people have multiple choices, sometimes when the system works well, there's a healthy degree of competition where nodes will realize or recognize other players in this network and perform better to adhere to delivering better services. It also can and does, which I've also shown in my own work, it can encourage and enable circular forms of accountability and oversight in which organizations within these networks can hold each other accountable because of that healthy competition. So it's not just a top-down hierarchical accountability, but it's a circular one, it's a horizontal one, each keeping a check on the other one. And as Sophie mentioned, she's talking about whole of society governance. Whole of society governance is desirable. It's what we want. We want all the actors that can be brought to bear to engage with the problem, to be involved in that problem. We want the best solution to that problem. So we need to draw on those who are able to do that. And it's not always or can only be one institution. In fact, it can never only be one institution, because we know that in the 21st century, our global problems are complex and not any one institution can resolve it. So polycentric networks are the means by which you can operationalize whole of society, because whole of society is a broad concept, but polycentric networks is how do you operationalize it? How do you achieve whole of society? This is the way you can do that. And I found in my own research as well and other research that it actually may be better placed to provide a public good than the state alone. Their normative understandings of the state alone can provide public good, but I found that if the conditions are right, non-state polycentric networks can provide for a public good, but if the conditions are right. So in other words, the benefits of polycentric networks is that they may be best placed to resolve complex governance challenges like in the humanitarian context. So there are many challenges, of course, of polycentric networks because of the fact that they are complex. They can be very complex systems, and it's difficult to sustain them. I think of the creation of the state as the creation of state, the creation of government, very complex systems, and very often their sustainability is tied very much into funding and support and legitimacy. And so sustainability is a real challenge, especially as Sophie was saying, in these resource-limited engagements or resource-limited sites. There's also issues around whether they should be spontaneous or deliberate. And very often the best performing polycentric networks are spontaneous, actually, because the people involved and the institutions and organizations involved in that want to be involved in it. And they've created it. And so they sustain because of their mutual gain. So it's very difficult sometimes to create a top-down network and to draw people in, because very often they have competing interests, competing resources, their concepts are different, they are siloed. So that's one of the biggest challenges. And it's related to also other issues in terms of complexity, sustainability, whether they work or not, in terms of who is included. Is it equitable? Who is excluded from these networks? Who is not benefiting from it? And so this relates to issues of, as Sophie was talking about, sometimes there are weak, corrupt, absent nodes, or perceptions of weak, corrupt, or absent nodes that can affect perceptions of legitimacy. And so powerful or legitimate actors may dominate, and their agendas may become at the forefront, whereas weaker actors are disempowered, marginalized. Their voices are not heard, particularly for displaced communities. So there might also be competing mentalities or logics, and this is what Sophie was talking about. The vulnerabilities is competing logic, it's competing understanding of vulnerability, and this might lead to conflict. I mean, one of the primary benefits of polycentric networks is only if they can achieve a common understanding, a common vision, or a common goal. If they don't, then you're going to have this competition in terms of discourse and who is more powerful to be able to enforce a particular discourse. And of course, Sophie also mentioned accountability. Accountability must keep pace with these pluralized developments. And very often there's a lot of literature around lack of accountability in plural networks because of the fact that there's so many hands, so many players, that no one entity is held accountable. The accountability gets passed along and deflected. And no one organization takes accountability at all, and they're not holding each other accountable either. And so polycentric systems have been accused of being undemocratic, ineffective, uncoordinated, or underregulated and unaccountable. But yet the reality is that we have them, and that is the only way to achieve whole of society. It's a bit of a conundrum, but when they work very well. And I have looked at contexts, particularly where they do work well, because I was looking for where do they work and why, so we could learn from that. And so they can and do work, but when they don't work, then they don't work at all, do they? So polycentric governance in humanitarian context, I mean, just to reflect a little bit on Sophie's work, it is the reality in most contexts. In fact, plurality and polycentricity has been a feature of the Global South because of the realities of statehood. It's just part of that governance practice. It's not something new. But of course, we have these competing logics of discourses of vulnerability that Sophie was talking about, lack of trust, coordination, and accountability between nodes, because ultimately a polycentric network can only work if there's trust. Even perceptions of corruption can undermine it. There has to be some sort of coordination and communication, and there has to be accountability between nodes. And of course, in these contexts, sometimes there's a reliance on both legitimate and illegitimate, licit and illicit nodes. It becomes part of the system. It's not just legitimate, licit entities. It can actually involve a number of informal components as well. I'm thinking maybe of the refugee-led organizations, new players coming in that may be informal. So there might be a conflict between formal and informal systems that become part of this network. And the weakest nodes, as Sophie was talking about, can become disempowered. Their voices could not be heard, or there could be competition around meanings, again, of vulnerability and vulnerabilities. So there's a governance messiness because it's highly pluralized. There's degrees of informality and hybridity. In terms of hybridity of multiple services being provided by both formal and informal sectors. And hybridity sometimes means the conflation or the merging of the state and non-state in some respects. And this is a feature of many African systems where systems become merged. You can't distinguish between whether it's a state or non-state, legitimate or illegitimate, formal or informal. So this is my last slide, actually, and it's really just a challenge. And this is my interpretation. So can we achieve effective and inclusive polycentric governance in these very difficult circumstances? And I think resources is a key. So maybe but consider also decoupling some Western-centric assumptions that I see coming through from Sophie's account and from this context because of donor aid. I mean, it's well known that of course there will be donor discourses and they may compete with other discourses, potentially, especially in this context, discourses of vulnerability felt by those on the ground. And of course, Sophie was talking about conditional vulnerability, really, in terms of obviously they're going to create these discourses for their own benefit, but nevertheless, there are still contestations around this and whose discourses win. And is it necessary then to reconsider the realities of that and the realities of governance in the African context? And again, considering particularly the lived experience of vulnerability, and especially when Sophie was talking about male GBV survivors. I mean, that is not a consideration within these framings of vulnerability, or wasn't at some point. And so do we need to decolonize? Is this about a decolonization process? Do we need to decolonize understandings of vulnerability? Because of the extreme amounts of trauma and the severity of what's been happening to these people, are Western-centric assumptions appropriate where we have particular understandings of vulnerability and also of order and governance? Because of the messiness, is it appropriate to think of this in a particular way? And what I mean about that is actually to decolonize theories of polycentric governance themselves, because that is a Western construct as well. And what I found with polycentric governance is that it's a tendency to think of nodes as institutions and organizations. And it's also to pathologize informality. The informal is problematic. The informal is necessarily wrong. But if it's part of the system, what do you do then? If informality and hybridity is part of the system, can polycentric governance account for that when it thinks of organizations and institutions as discrete entities and thinks of it in terms of state and non-state instead of formal, informal, illicit even? I mean, illicit is undesirable. I mean, that's the very nature of it. But do we need to then decolonize our understanding of polycentric governance in applying it to an African context? Thank you. That is it from me.
Well, this was an impressive way to kind of reply, so to say, to Sophie by incorporating all her observations in your kind of framework. If I take two sentences, I hope you don't mind, from your presentation. The first was, if the conditions are right. I mean, I think this could be the title of a critical analysis. And the other one is, and that reflects also what Sophie said, the answer is resource-based. So I think your two presentations really were very complementary with each other, which leaves us, thanks to you, because you have been very respectful of your time, it leaves us the last presentation, and the slot is now yours, Larissa, and you take us to Germany and the bureaucracy in Germany in dealing with asylum seekers. The floor is yours, Larissa.
Thank you very Yes, you should be able to hear me now. Thank you very much. I also would like to thank Sophie and the whole VULNER team for this invitation. I've been following their research for the past years with vivid interest, although my own research takes place in a very different context. But I want to use this opportunity to kind of juxtapose my research context to the Ugandan context. And I think the few comments that I would like, or observations that I would like to make, also follow up very nicely on Julie's presentation, because I will move from the meso-level institutional perspective of governance to the social, the perspective of individual social actors. And I would like to speak or make a few observations on the social life of legal bureaucratic categorizations, and contribute comparative observations that emerge from ethnographic research in Germany on status fragmentation. So in my own research, I look at status fragmentation in German asylum and immigration law. That means I look at how various actors, migrants, lawyers, bureaucrats, and judges handle, in the sense of negotiating, reinforcing, or transcending, legal bureaucratic status categorizations when they interact in specific rights claiming situations. So that could be an administrative procedure. It can also be court proceedings. And I've not specifically looked at vulnerability. For that, I would refer you, or I would highly recommend the publications of the German VULNER team and their work. But I nevertheless think, so it's also a very different context from the humanitarian resettlement context that we are talking about today in Uganda. But I think that a comparison or a juxtaposition of these two contexts can nevertheless be fruitful for recognizing the inevitable social practices and the social life of legal bureaucratic categorizations, and also take them into consideration when we think about the effectiveness or also the equitableness, as Julie has just mentioned, of addressing the protection needs of refugees. And just kind of very briefly, I will distinguish between, when I talk about status fragmentation, I will distinguish between a structural level of status fragmentation and a more individually or subjectively experienced form of status fragmentation. And with subjectively, I don't mean in the sense of subjective, but I mean in the sense from a specific subject position, just to clarify that. And I'll start with the German context, and then I'll make a reference to some of the things that Sophie has mentioned. So in a very basic sense, when we look at immigration regimes of countries like Germany, we have a distinction between citizens with a full set of political, social, and civil rights and non-citizens. But within this category of non-citizens, we have, of course, ever finer distinctions between different set of non-citizens, and the legal status they are granted are attached to different bundles of rights. I will keep it very short. You all know we have the distinction EU citizens, third country nationals. We have a distinction between a protection status or an immigration status or residence title for specific purposes. And each of these statuses is connected to different sets of rights. Next to this legal framework, we also have an added layer of executive regulations and administrative guidelines that introduce further distinctions. A well-known example in the German context is the administrative category of the Bleibeperspektive, which is an administrative category that is based on a statistical calculation of how successful a chance for an asylum application might be. And based on that calculation, asylum seekers are granted access to a language and integration course or are denied this access. So there's another right that is either granted or denied based on such categorizations. The VULNER team has also highlighted for the German context that the federal structure of Germany creates further regional differentiations and adds to this structural fragmentation. And when we compare that, or when we juxtapose that to the Ugandan context, we see similar forms of structural fragmentation at play. So Sophie mentioned vulnerability for the purpose of resettlement is defined differently than for the purpose from support in the settlement. So we have two sets of categories there. Specific NGOs apply specific categories of vulnerability based on the specific needs they are addressing. And Sophie mentioned also that this question of livelihood and distance from the settlement creates also this type of regional fragmentation and differential access to services. But what I want to focus on, and what I think most ethnographic studies do, and Sophie has also shown that with her research, is this what I call the individual or subjectively experienced status fragmentation that arises from the fact that all actors involved in these administrative or judicial procedures are, of course, social actors and add their own agency to these categorizations. So very well known from a range of ethnographic studies on migration contexts worldwide is that judicial and bureaucratic discretion leads to different outcomes and to additional practical categorizations that might also not always be in line with the formal categorizations. In my own work, for example, I was able to empirically trace how bureaucrats that are involved in visa application procedures in Germany develop their own interpretation and their own practical norms about the existing visa regulations, and then in a way codify these practical norms by inserting them into administrative guidelines, thereby making their practical norms the de facto basis of decision making. And I think this might not be very different from the ways that UNHCR or state or NGO actors in the Ugandan context interpret and specify the specific needs codes that are used for vulnerability assessments, especially, as Sophie has pointed out, under severe resource and funding limitations. I think this was also a general finding of the first phase of VULNER research, and it was highlighted in one of the final reports of this first phase that, of course, bureaucrats often need to strike a balance between systematic and standardized bureaucratic practices and the flexibility that is required to address actual experiences of vulnerabilities, which are, of course, always contextually and socially embedded. At the same time, this flexibility also risks or may create new inequalities and fragmentations in access to services. So in another case study that I did on administrative judges in the German context, I found that bureaucrats can not only restrict, but also sometimes enable a wider interpretation of category, or even what I called switching of categories. So I could observe that among these judges, there was an interpretation of procedural justice that allowed them in interactions during the court hearing to explore together with the claimants possibilities of changing track from an asylum claim to another claim under immigration law. So in a way, there was an opening of a space to explore switching categories here. And I just wanted to give you some examples of how bureaucrats use their agency and create a social life around certain categories in German asylum and immigration law. Of course, bureaucrats are not the only ones who have agency. Again, a typical ethnographic finding is that migrants exercise their agency and they navigate these fragmented status systems by fitting their needs or their life plans into established categories and to fulfill their purposes. And thereby they simultaneously may further reify or reinforce these bureaucratic and legal categorizations, which originally might have been relatively disconnected from social realities and might unevenly address actual needs. And this process of internalizing and also mobilizing bureaucratic legal categories can then create new inequalities and differential access to protection or services. Typical examples are collective forms of mobilization. I had that in the case where I investigated the administrative guidelines, where then migrant organizations lobbied for the recognition that they could also participate in the process of formulating recommendations to change the administrative guidelines. In her report, or now I think Sophie also mentioned it, that male victims of sexual or gender-based violence formed an NGO and mobilized for the recognition as vulnerable persons. And very often you also have individual strategies of what I call inhabiting categories. So in the German context, in these court hearings that I observed with asylum applicants, unsuccessful asylum applicants, one strategy that became visible was in marrying and having children in Germany in order to mobilize the protection of family life in order to be able to stay in Germany. And I was able to show that what is often depicted as an abuse of the legal system is in fact a co-produced unintended consequence of existing categorizations, fragmented categorizations, or categorizations that fragment rights. And I think Sophie has similar examples of people shaping their life in a manner that it fits into a vulnerability category. She mentioned the police reports, the illicit documentary practices, and I think these are very similar processes that from one perspective are seen as illicit and from another perspective as trying to fit into a category to access a necessary right. So what we see in all these cases of status fragmentation and across these two different contexts is that seemingly standardized categorizations have a social life of their own. And when we kind of now speak concretely about vulnerability, even when it is applied as an increasingly juridified and bureaucratized category, it produces the same ambivalent effects that we know from many other legal bureaucratic categorizations. It simultaneously in and excludes. It allows to mobilize a certain category for emancipatory purposes, but also for repressive or restrictive purposes. And it can at the same time provide protection against or create new grounds of discrimination and unequal treatment. So what do we do? How do we take this complex and inevitable social life of legal and bureaucratic categorizations meaning their potential to not only describe and capture, but also change and produce new social realities into account. And I think I might be wrong here, but I think in policy circles, one way to think about it, or one way forward, is to kind of think of more fine-tuned, more standardized categorizations, more fine-grained categorizations of vulnerability. But I want to just kind of, as a very tentative suggestion and for the discussion, bring up two other suggestions that come from this juxtaposition of the humanitarian resettlement context, the global south context, with the global north context. And one suggestion refers to something that has been long advocated and practiced in the development context. And we've heard a lot about it from Mr. Ochala, and it's a pity that he cannot be here with us and also give us his insights on this. This is, I'm thinking about proactive participatory approaches that have a long tradition in the development context, but we have not heard much about such participatory approaches for assessing vulnerability in the European context. And the other suggestion I want to bring forward is something that we hear in the European legal discourse. And I mean, one of the suggestions I'm making has more of an anthropological take. The other one is more a legalistic, and I kind of just want to throw them together and seize what happens when we cross-fertilize them. And so the more legalistic approach that I want to bring in is recent debates about anti-discrimination law in the field of migration law. And to creatively think about can we take the legal test that is used to determine discrimination from the arena of court litigation, where it's now being debated in Europe, and build it into bureaucratic procedures as an assessment or evaluation step in the programming cycle. And I think this legal test, which asks, is there a legitimate justification for differential treatment? Are the means to achieve this aim proportionate? Is it based on unsubstantiated stereotyping or on concrete evidence? Are helpful ways for kind of thinking or of ex post evaluating not just policies, but actual practices and capturing unintended effects and indirect forms of discrimination. And so what I want to conclude with is that these are just very tentative. I'm basically throwing out thoughts based on this juxtaposition of two contexts. And I not only want to say we should think about methodologies which have arisen in one context in another context, but we should also think about the different actors, the bureaucrats and the migrants, and can we switch the methodologies? Can we have participatory appraisals with bureaucrats, or can we have anti-discrimination tests as an exercise we are doing with migrants? And so I'm basically just opening the box here for discussion and would end at this point.
Well, now I depend on instructions from I don't know who, because the time is what it is. We have a few minutes left. I think if I see three insights that were recurring in the presentations, is this everybody looking for a kind of inclusive approach, which is that we have a whole of society governance, something that as many people as possible can be involved in the way forward. I see in all the presentations the gap between what categories are and what they do to people, with people, against people. On the one hand, categories are necessary and the decision maker knows it. Yeah. On the other hand, if they're not really aligning with the realities or not enough, then they produce all types of undesirable effects. And then, Larissa, your last kind of proposal, why not look at categories through the lens of justifiable differential treatments? Yeah, that is, of course, a whole kind of a dream of everybody. There is need for differential treatment, but it must be proportionate, it must be necessary, it must be justifiable, and some people have to look after this. So I think this would be for another discussion probably. I personally experienced that the presentations were extremely complementary, and now I don't know what to do with the remaining time, because you invite us for a discussion, Larissa. We said that the discussion would start and would be really within the framework of the chat. Unless mistaken, I didn't see questions in the chat. And now I leave it maybe to you, Luc, how you would benefit the most of this event. Shall we switch to Catherine and then have the concluding remarks? Or would you nevertheless take the risk of expanding a little bit the time slot and then welcome nevertheless a few questions? Luc, I'm now a bit depending on you, because you're the one who will then take this discussion further in the VULNER project.
I'm not sure if I'm the right one to answer, because I don't know, Sophie and Peter. I'm looking to you. What I'd suggest maybe is, Catherine, if you have some comments you'd like to make, you can make them now, and then we can stay. I think everyone, as long as you're available to answer a question of the people who very kindly joined us today. If that's a good idea, Sophie, I don't know.
So we swap the order. We give first Catherine the floor, and then we see what the remaining times brings. So Catherine, the answer comes from Luc, and now the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you for organizing this important discussions. And I think it's been very interesting to see how you can talk about the same issue from so many sort of disciplinary and social positions and institutional positions. Maybe I might bring in something else to the discussion as well, but and I will try to be brief. And I was hoping that there would be a discussion that I could also rely on. But I just wanted to, so I'll give a few points related to vulnerability, which is the main theme, and try to bring in some of the perspectives that has been raised. But I think I would like to start where also Henok was talking earlier, and you know, we're talking about an immense problem of protracted displacement, where resources are often scarce, as many of you have said, and where there is a problem in thinking about how do we support people so they survive, but how do we also seek towards durable solutions? So I think there are an extreme number of dilemmas in this discussion that we need to keep at the forefront when we are discussing. What's been interesting with the discussion so far is, I think, that we haven't questioned the notion of vulnerability very much. We have taken the category of vulnerability as a sort of meaning of vulnerability very much as the starting point. And I think it's interesting to understand how this problematic notion of vulnerability is very much taken for granted in a lot of the discussions here, but also beyond this in the field. The category-based understanding of vulnerability has been used in two ways in this discussion, I think, but you can arrest me if I'm wrong. One is to use as eligibility for assistance in a system which is very stretched for resources and where there is a need to decide who need that assistance the most. The other category, or the other way of using vulnerability, is to assess who is eligible for resettlement or durable solutions. And I think that even though these two are related, they're often used quite differently in different contexts. And I think that's very important. I also think that maybe the challenge with this way of discussing vulnerability is that it's a very technocratic way of thinking about it. And in some ways, it depoliticizes some of the more ontological questions around vulnerability. And I think we need to keep that in mind. I thought it was very interesting to think about how this kind of ontological reality of categories also in a way creates vulnerability, because people move, as Larissa and I think also Sophie mentioned, people use these categories to place themselves and to kind of create their reality as vulnerable to be able to reach any of these types of assistance or solutions. So this kind of depoliticization of vulnerability through this technocratic kind of uses of vulnerability also makes a deeply unequal system, which also becomes very political in many ways. So I think that if we had moved to open up this discussion towards a more ontological understanding of vulnerability, maybe we had started in a different way. But this is, you know, a reflection that I think I would like to bring in. And I think that if we bring in that and the discussion about a more ontological understanding of vulnerability as the experience, I felt that perhaps the experience of refugees themselves were actually not so present. I had kind of expected that there would be more reference to that experience in the discussion. But what was coming out very clearly is the potential that people who experienced forced migration also has this potential of negotiating these categories and mobilize them and use them. And I think that's something that we always need to keep in mind. And in the interest of time, I would like to just maybe go to a couple of key questions or discussion points that could move from here. Maybe I could start with the issue, because during the two first presentations, I was thinking how the international community is used in a very abstract form. And I think Julie's comment on polycentric governance is an interesting way of trying to operationalize what this international community is in this way. And the state was not very present in this discussions, although it's there as a sort of taken for granted unit. But of course, there's a lot of different interests. Julie, I was when you were saying, could this work in the humanitarian context? I was thinking, no, it can't work. Why? It's not because it's a lack of resources, but it's never going to become a political agreement about how to operate within the system. So for me, that's a sort of very interesting way that if polycentric governance has to agree on one particular aim, I think that it's very difficult to see how these different interests can be overcome. But maybe that's that I was wanting to think that we could reflect more on that. Also, I think, should we expand the number of vulnerability categories? There are 100. Will nuancing them more, work? Or do we need to advocate for a complete change of how we think about the refugee regime? And should we think of resilience as the opposite of vulnerable, or agency as the opposite of victim? And how do we also nuance the way that we understand that refugees are actually mobilizing around these types of categories? And can that also help us? And that brings to the very last thing about participation. Absolutely, of course, we need to nuance. And I think we can learn a lot in humanitarian studies from participation, because participation is used very tokenistic so far, I think, in humanitarian studies. So thank you for bringing that in, which came in several ways. Part of that is the citizenship notion, which of course is very problematic when we talk about refugees. I'll stop there, and it's already over time, so.
Well, thank you so much. I think very rich reflections, and I think I'm so happy we are recording this, because this will enable the VULNER team just to do something more with the conclusion than just listen to you today. Thank you so much for this input, Kathleen. We do have in the meantime one question, and I would say, and maybe we close the session with that one question that is addressed to you, Sophie, and it comes from the ZIP, Samuel. Maybe you're still in the room, maybe you just put your question or you read your question loud. It's about agency. So if you put your question yourself, if Sophie answers, then we can close it.
Okay, thank you very much for the thought-provoking presentation. And I would like to ask you that you mentioned about something about the agency of some refugees to challenge those categories. But I know also in the refugee camps, as I also worked in different refugee camps in Africa, there are some structures set by refugee authority, how those agency roles of those interact with the structure set by camp authority. Those structures are led by refugees in the camp. Mostly they are engaged in normalizing, disciplining context. So how do those interact, the one that you mentioned?
Indeed, there are camp structure, the refugee structures but they're not well respected in Uganda. In fact, refugees themselves feel that they are corrupt. They identify vulnerable people who pay them, So those officially recognized refugee-based structures are not necessarily respected by the refugees. In fact, they're considered illegitimate. If you don't have money, then you don't make it on their vulnerability list. So that's why refugees join these other categories these other structures, because they choose their own leaders. They feel that with these structures, sometimes even if people are elected, they feel like the election process is not also very fair or democratic. Yeah.
Is this
I don't know if that answers you.
Is this an answer to your question, Samuel?
Yeah, I would like also to hear her reflection that they are more the structures within the refugee camp framework. They are normalizing and also in the support of normalizing the existing system rather than helping the refugees to act independently, plan, and then challenge those practices.
Okay, yeah. In that sense, you're right, because they are part of the whole of society approach, They're part of the system, You will identify people at this level, and they're supposed to identify according to existing categories. So they don't depart from those categories, even though they know that they don't work. In fact, what is interesting here is that a refugee aid worker was criticizing the system he works in. He was saying, if you come to me and you ask me, what do I want? And I tell you, I want trousers, but you bring me a dress. How is that helpful? So meaning that even though they do conduct these assessments, they use these refugees themselves to conduct participatory assessments or inquiries, they know that nothing is going to change. They're just fulfilling the bureaucratic categories that UNHCR set up, So they are there to affirm existing categories. They don't challenge them. And if they do, they dare not do it openly. Yeah.
I think this is very much the evidence that the continuation of this discussion, how do we deal with categories, what do they do to, with, against people, need to be continued. Now, the VULNER project is not yet coming to a close. I think, look, you will continue working on these questions. I think the VULNER website is also very open access in terms of all the findings. And I know, Sophie, that you're just completely open to continuing this communication. So for the sake of time and also out of respect for all the people who had this on their schedule for today up to now, I would say I close this session. I thank everybody for the input, and I hope you, Luc and Sophie, you have really harvested a number of insights that can help you further. Thank you so much to everybody. And also thank you for Population Europe to make it just possible. So nice afternoon to everybody, wherever you might be on the world or in the globe. And see you maybe at another opportunity. Thank you.